Welcome to the Reach Further podcast, where we share insights from experts who have experienced it all. We hope these conversations spark ideas for you to become the successful entrepreneur that you were meant to be. Brought to you by East West Bank, your financial bridge.
What I think is most threatening is the attempt to not listen to the will of the people. I think about Asian Americans. We're the fastest growing racial minority group according to this last census. We're also the fastest growing electorate. Mm-hmm. And if you think about the last national election, one of the main motivating reasons for Asians to vote was because of racism. They wanted to register their vote and their concern that we need political leadership to systematically address racism in this country. And I think that it is really important, especially at this moment, to recognize that some parts of our community has had more visibility, some hyper visibility, right, and not always in the best way, and some who've experienced erasure, like Pacific Islanders, like our what we call our brown Asians, right, from India, Bangladeshi. So I think that that's part of, I think, what this period is about. It's about lifting up those diversities, but also the challenges that we face when some of us are more visible, when some of us feel as though we have more of a voice. And it comes down to resources, and it comes down to priorities.
The differences between the different communities is definitely important to highlight. Also talking about the differences just between generations, right? Like I am first generation American born Asian. My parents were the ones that immigrated to America, and our views on this are very different. How are you guys targeting, reaching out to these older generations who have such a different mindset than the younger ones who are much more, I'd say, politically active and kind of socially aware of what's going on?
Yeah, that's such a great question. This is the one issue, anti-Asian hate, that is rallying our community. Because just like the murder of Vincent Chin in the 80s, where our community rallied to support Lily Chin, the mother of Vincent Chin. It was a reminder to so many Asian Americans that it didn't matter who you were or what your ethnicity was. The fact that you could be targeted and killed just because of the way you looked. It's having that effect here, but on a much grander scale, reaching, parts of our community that might have a different view. And that's harder to do, I think. One of the things that CAA has done is we've invested over the last few years of being in spaces like WeChat and Weibo and other places, because we have a major, like in the English language, a major misinformation and disinformation challenge. And this is also happening in those spaces too, where people are getting information. And it's even more so because it's censored, it's unregulated. At least there's a pretense that we're trying to regulate or moderate these spaces. So not just on COVID, but on so many. I mean, we had this person, this 18-year-old young person, young man, who became radicalized. Fearing that the white race was going to be replaced by communities of color. So the misinformation is something that we want to take seriously. And also we have to believe in the fact that while there might be some bad actors in these spaces, a majority of people are looking for facts and information.
So kind of going back a little bit to what you said about racism kind of being one of the biggest motivators for Asian Americans to become a part of the electorate, has their awareness of the racism that they are facing, the increase in that, made them also more aware of, racism that other minority groups are facing? Because as we've seen in social media, the Black Lives Matter movement and all the anti-Black hate that these communities have been facing for centuries, really. How do we fight anti-Blackness within Asian communities?
Yeah, well, I think that it's it's incredibly important that during this time when we are speaking out and condemning, anti-Asian hate, that we also do that when other communities are targeted. And I know that we have. I mean, who could watch George Floyd being murdered right before our very eyes?
Right.
Who could really not recognize the fact that we have synagogues and Sikh temples and the El Paso shooting where Latinx community members were gunned down. So it is really important that, we're not just concerned about issues that impact our community, because we're all fighting the same system. I want to talk about the Dallas shooter because it's obviously top of my mind.
Right.
Because for me, I'm always questioning, how did this young person become radicalized? What were the failures in his public education system? What led to him feeling like he needed to purchase a gun to actually hunt down and target people? You'd have to get to another state of mind where you are not actually seeing others as human beings, as grandmothers, as fathers, going to pick up his 3-year-old's birthday cake. I mean, this is the kind of, I think, social conditioning that we have to combat, and that includes in our public education system. But we also have to shut down these spaces where hate is allowed to spread so quickly. In some ways, I feel like our public education system is not enough to inoculate, especially young people. And what I'm seeing is a trend among young men to essentially internalize this hate and to act out their hate. We've got to point to the fact that historically there's a pattern, right? You have elected officials, people who are powerful, who are sowing this hate using racist demagoguery. That becomes justification to stoke fear amongst the general public and people. That follows with laws that codify that hate. I've been doing a lot of reading in my spare time. And for me, it's very, very important to understand, the roots of slavery, the roots of genocide, understanding how our criminal justice system and our immigration systems were essentially institutionalized to ban us, to deny us our rights. And this is something that we have to understand as we think about how do we respond, during this time when it comes to hate that we're experiencing today.
Minority groups, I feel, are very segregated from each other. Like, model minority myth has been very successful in doing that. And then there's also a bunch of cultural and maybe even language barriers that kind of exacerbate that issue. So how do you get our communities to understand that racism is a systemic issue, and it's not as if, racism only happens to this one group or only happens to that one group, but it's something that actually affects us all?
I certainly see our public education systems as being a cornerstone. I have this perch where I get to talk to a lot of different people from across the country. And what I'm seeing is that local communities are coming together with their neighbors and talking about safety and talking about basic needs that their communities have. The truth is that hate is on the rise for so many groups. And I think this has been a moment where we have seen an outpouring of compassion and also demand for meaningful change, right? How many rallies, how many protests do we have to have? And I think that this is something that I think is really important to know. It's very, very hard not to be cynical and not to feel hopeless, right? Especially coming off this past weekend. But I think it's really important that this is a time that we really double down and re-engage and recommit to being an anti-racist. This is not like a checklist. This is a continual commitment. We're all on this journey, and we're all part of the social conditioning. There really isn't anyone who is immune to, I think, all the different ways that we have been taught to see others, even within our own communities. So I think to see communities coming together, there's a real hunger and a thirst to understand, to have difficult conversations. You know, it used to be in workplaces that you never talked about politics, you never talked about gender or race.
Right, impolite topics.
Exactly, and you really went out of your way to avoid having these difficult conversations.
Yep, talk only about the weather.
Right, and I think that that's really changed, and I think that's for the better. We have to do more, obviously. I mean, part of what Stop AAPI Hate is doing is we're working with our legislature, policymakers at the local, state, and national level to make really clear demands. We're not going to be able to legislate or police our way out of this situation. We need a much more holistic approach to dealing with harm, to preventing it, and to doing it in a way where we build cross-community solidarity.
A lot of the policies that you are advocating for that are community-based policies. I understand that a lot of the current responses that legislatures are, I guess, advocating for and pushing for are, you know, increased policing, which clearly does not work for a number of reasons. So what are some of these community-based policies that you and Stop AAPI Hate and CAA are advocating for, and what is the success that you've seen from those?
Those of us who are advocating for more community-based solutions, holistic approaches that get at root causes, we're doing this because what we know is that policing and an overemphasis on those strategies hasn't worked. We incarcerate more people than anywhere else in the world. If I polled people today and asked them, do you feel safer? I would hazard to guess that it would be no. And so I think that we have been fed this idea that that we need more police, we need more surveillance, that we need more harsher punishments, that's going to lead to our safety. And the data just doesn't bear that out. And so where I want to put our energies and resources is making sure that victims and survivors get full support, because we know that when we experience trauma and that doesn't get the support to fully recover and heal, we know that, you know, when trauma is not transformed, it's transmitted, right? So I think that we have to deal with that. The fact that our prison population is made up of people who have experienced abuse, high percentage of abuse, sexual, physical types of abuse. That's got to be telling us something, right? So I think we have been so accustomed to using the harshest, most bluntest instruments that we have. And now it's time to really examine, well, what are the types of investments that we can make that are essentially about getting people's basic needs being met? Right? For people to live with dignity, to get support, whether or not they have a mental illness or drug addiction. We need to think about ways in which we can actually help people Because when we actually help people, they are less likely to hurt others. And so these are the things that I think we're the most passionate about. And I have to say, you know, we talk a lot about accountability, and that is part of what we need, what needs to happen as well. And I think that there's lots of different ways that we're seeing community-based efforts to have more accountability, especially for young people. You know, we're seeing some real success there, but it's really underinvested in, and we've really invested much more on carceral solutions that, again, hasn't led to our safety.
Yeah, imagine the difference it would make if we took even a fraction of, you know, the funding that police receive and put it towards like community improvement and betterment and helping the people who actually need this kind of help and support systems.
Yeah, and you know, for us, you know, we do a lot of work in San Francisco. It's very local. We're part of a coalition that was really formed long before the COVID-19 related racism was even here, because violence and members of our community, you know, were just not being served. So community safety for me is something really, really basic, which is somebody is being harmed or hurt or needs assistance, and they call 911, and somebody on the other line understands what they need. That to me is community safety. Community safety is also people who rely on public transportation feeling like they can do that without fearing like they're going to be harassed on the streets. Community safety is about making sure that people who are experiencing mental health, severe mental illness, or drug addiction, that they're getting support that they need before they harm themselves or others. And I think that that has to be part of, you know, when we think about community safety.